Okay, so in the previous video we talked about the stomach, and the stomach is going to result in the production of a very acidic, pasty material that's called chyme. So that's going to be entering the duodenum, which is this first part of the small intestine. So in this drawing, the stomach has been removed, and that's okay because we already learned what it does. So this acidic chyme enters the small intestine. The small intestine is going to produce two really important hormones, CCK and secretin. And together, those two hormones are in essence waking up the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas because those three organs are necessary for what the small intestine is going to need to do. So we're going to cause the production of bicarbonate and secretion of bicarbonate by the pancreas. That's a job of secretin. We're going to stimulate the enzymes of the pancreas, and that's a job of CCK. We're going to stimulate the gallbladder, ejection of bile, that's CCK. And we're going to stimulate the liver with secretin to produce more bile. So now we're going to get all these secretions traveling towards the duodenum. And the bile is going to come out of the gallbladder and the liver and travel down towards the duodenum in what's called the common bile duct. And then we're going to be secreting what we call pancreatic juice, which is a mixture of that bicarbonate and digestive enzymes. And that's going to go into the duodenum. So what exactly is in this pancreatic juice? Well, we have the buffer. All right, remember bicarbonate's going to act as a buffer for that very acidic chyme that's going to enter. So the small intestine doesn't have a thick layer of mucus like the stomach, so that acid would really erode the wall of the small intestine. So we got to buffer it, and that's the job of bicarbonate. Then we got a bunch of enzymes. We have to basically add all new enzymes because remember, when the pH changes dramatically, enzymes don't work, right? So whatever enzymes worked in the stomach, which was pepsin and lipase, it's not going to work in the small intestine. And remember, the amylase didn't work in the stomach, so we're going to have to add another amylase. So we add a pancreatic amylase to pick back up our carbohydrate digestion, because remember, it paused during the stomach. We're going to add in a couple enzymes that digest protein, so we often call these proteases, but specifically we have trypsin and chymotrypsin. So those are slightly different enzymes. They digest at slightly different locations on proteins, but they're going to start, continuing that protein digestion. We add in another lipase, pancreatic lipase, which is going to continue our digestion of triglycerides. We even add in enzymes that digest RNA and DNA, ribonuclease and deoxyribonuclease. Now, DNA and RNA aren't typically considered nutrients. You technically don't need them in your diet, but we do have a lot of DNA and RNA in our diet because we eat plants and animals that have DNA and RNA. So we do have enzymes that will digest those molecules, break them down into smaller parts, and we'll use them for things. So we digest DNA and RNA, and that's pancreatic juice. So all that is secreted from the pancreas using a couple ducts. There's what's called the pancreatic duct, and then there's a little accessory duct that brings some of the secretions into that first part of the small intestine. So that's your pancreas. Don't forget that it also has an endocrine function. So this is all exocrine. But we also have hormones that are regulating our blood sugar. Right? We have insulin and glucagon. So don't forget about those roles, the role of those hormones in glucose homeostasis. All right, on to the liver. So the liver produces bile. All right, that's one function of the liver. If we don't need the bile yet, all right, so we're kind of in between meals, there's no material in the small intestine, there's a little sphincter down here that closes, and it keeps that bile from coming into the small intestine. and instead it'll basically back up into the gallbladder. So if we need the bile, we just let it go all the way down. If we don't need it yet, we'll store it and let it concentrate in the gallbladder. But what else does your liver do? It's going to store glucose as glycogen, so that kind of comes a little later. So let's say we absorb a bunch of sugar, all right, as we absorb a bunch of glucose. That's too much for that moment in time. We can store it as glycogen. And again, that's the main function of insulin, is to tell that liver, hey, we've got too much blood sugar, let's store it as glycogen. It's also going to produce some lipids. So your liver produces cholesterol for you, so you don't really need cholesterol in your diet. Your liver will make it. It also will make triglycerides and send them out for storage. Now, we're going to talk about these lipoproteins a little later, but how lipids are transported in your blood are by way of lipoproteins. So we package them with protein. And the ones that transport cholesterol from the liver are called low-density lipoproteins, or LDL. The ones that are transporting triglycerides are called VLDL, very low density. But we'll revisit those in a little bit. Amino acids. So when you digest protein, break it down into amino acids, absorb the amino acids, they go to the liver via the portal vein, and the liver has to remove the amino group. So every amino acid has what's called an amino group, and that has to be removed if we're going to be using that amino acid. So the liver pulls off that amino group, and it gets metabolized into a waste product called urea. So urea is one of these metabolic waste molecules produced by your liver that eventually has to be excreted. And we excrete most of that in our urine. So that's a really main component of your urine. It'll detoxify anything. It will store some things. So it can store some vitamin A, D, K, vitamin B12. It can also store some minerals like iron and copper. And then we've already learned these functions. It produces some of our clotting factors. It produces some of our plasma proteins like albumin and fibrinogen. So the list of functions of your liver is pretty darn long. But at this moment in time, when we're just looking at, digesting nutrients in our small intestine, it's producing the bile, which is going to be important for our lipid digestion. So that brings us to kind of bile. So bile, again, produced by the liver. Bile secretion is stimulated by three main things. So we're going to use the vagus nerve to help stimulate bile ejection from the gallbladder. We're going to use CCK to stimulate the gallbladder. So that gallbladder gets stimulated by both the nervous system, vagus nerve, and the endocrine system, cholecystokinin. We also need to stimulate the liver itself to secrete the bile, and that's more of the job of secretin. All right, so this is kind of showing the stimulation of bile secretion. The most important things on this figure is to look at cholecystokinin coming from that duodenum or duodenum. It's been pronounced a lot of different ways. And that's going eventually to stimulate the gallbladder. Secretin, that one's eventually going to the liver to stimulate bile secretion. And then we have the vagus nerve coming down from your brain, stimulating the gallbladder. Lipoproteins. So let's go back to these. So again, a lipoprotein is part lipid, part protein. And remember, the reasoning behind this is that lipids are hydrophobic. So they don't like to be in water. So if you're transporting lipids around the body in blood or lymph, we have to package those with some proteins. And on this side, these are the two lipoproteins that are transporting most of your cholesterol. So cholesterol is produced by your liver and is sent out throughout the body. It's utilized by every cell in your body as part of the plasma membrane, so it has to basically get to every cell of your body. It also is used as a precursor to produce steroids, so we have to deliver it to those organs. So how it goes from the liver throughout the body is we package it into what's called low-density lipoprotein, LDL. Just so happens this is quote-unquote the bad cholesterol, because if you have high amounts of this form, you're sending a lot of cholesterol out throughout the body. And when you have a lot of cholesterol throughout the body, it can clog arteries. It can contribute to atherosclerosis. All right, so in the medical world, we do blood tests, and if your LDL is over a certain range, that's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Now, some cholesterol goes back to the liver for elimination. That cholesterol is packaged into what's called HDL, high-density lipoprotein. Basically, they can separate these by density. The more protein you have, the more dense you are. The more lipid you have, kind of the less dense you are. So anyway, the difference in these two cholesterols is not the cholesterol, it's where it's going. If it's going towards the liver, that's more of a good thing. So we often refer to this cholesterol as good cholesterol, because we're basically removing excess cholesterol. All right. So to understand cholesterol, you can't just know one. You got to know both of them. So you want to try to lower your LDL and raise your HDL. All right. And obviously there's diet that influences this. There's medications, but those are your two main cholesterols. If we look down here, VLDLs transport your triglycerides, most of your triglycerides. Now notice there's kind of a mixture of both in all these, but these are best known for your triglyceride transportation. And those, are being produced by your liver and then going out to adipose tissue. So again, if you're bringing in a lot of calories in your diet, your liver is going to convert a lot of that to triglycerides and then send it out to your adipose tissue. So that's the VLDL. Now this one is a little bit different. These are not in your bloodstream. These are in your lymphatics. So this is how we package the lipids that you just absorbed from your diet. So those would be your dietary lipids that enter in from your small intestine. They go into your lymph, your lacteals, and we need to have them in a transportable form. And that's called the chylomicrons. All right, so these are the four. There's some other lipoproteins, but these are your main lipoproteins. Again, they're used to transport lipids in either your bloodstream or your lymphatics. All right, finally, let's talk a little bit about the gallbladder. So again, the gallbladder is a bladder, so kind of like your urinary bladder. It's not producing anything, it's just storing it. So your urinary bladder obviously doesn't produce urine. It gets it from your kidneys. So the gallbladder does not produce bile, it gets it from your liver. So your liver uses these hepatic ducts to transport that bile into what's known as the cystic duct. That's how you get into the gallbladder, but that's also how bile is going to come out of the gallbladder. So it stores and concentrates the bile, so it's going to get a lot of bile throughout the day. And it's not big enough, so it has to concentrate that volume down a bit. All right. So then the question is, what is this bile? So it's a combination of all kinds of stuff in there. Remember, one component is bilirubin, so it's how we can get rid of that bilirubin metabolite from heme. And it's a mixture of things. It's got a little cholesterol, some what we call bile salts, a phospholipid, but its job is twofold. It helps us get rid of the bilirubin. All right, so now we have a way to get that bilirubin into our intestines. And then for our purposes now is it's an emulsifier. So it emulsifies and then helps to absorb your lipids. So its role is in lipid. All right, now it's not an enzyme, so it doesn't digest the lipids. All right, that's the job of lipase. Its job is to disperse the fat. All right, fat's going to want to kind of glob together, right? Because fat doesn't like to be in water. So you have to disperse it. You have to separate it out into smaller, more manageable kind of globs of fat. So it's kind of like what acid does for your protein digestion. It doesn't actually do the digestion, but it helps. This is going to help your lipid digestion. So if you don't have a gallbladder, maybe you had some gallstones or some other problem where it's blocking the bile and they have to remove that gallbladder, you can still produce bile and you can still get bile into your small intestines. It's just not the highly concentrated bile. So you have to really work to lower your fat intake. All right, so that's the gallbladder. The flow of bile, a little bit redundant. We already talked about it. But again, produced in your liver, travels by the hepatic ducts, either into your gallbladder for storage, or we can just send it straight down along with the bile from the gallbladder and eventually send it all down into that duodenum. At this little point here, you actually have a merge of two ducts. Notice this common bile duct comes down, the pancreatic duct comes over and forms a little combination duct called the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So in this little opening here, you have bile and pancreatic juice entering the duodenum. And there's a little sphincter that controls that. It's called the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or a sphincter of Oddi. So if you don't need these secretions because you're in between meals, that little sphincter closes. If you need these secretions, it relaxes and allows the flow into the duodenum. All right? All right, so that's probably a good place to stop this video. We're still in the small intestine. We haven't really talked about it. We've talked about the liver, adding in bile. We've talked about the gallbladder, adding in bile. We've talked about the pancreas, adding in enzymes and bicarbonate, but we haven't really talked about the small intestine itself. So we'll talk about the small intestine in the next video.